Today I wanted to show you about a different casting media that a little bit different from what you normally see online. Typically you're going to see a lot of molds like this made out of a polyurethane or a polyester gel coat and then hit it with some fiberglass. This right here is Drystone Casting Media. It's essentially plaster of Paris with a couple different polymers mixed into it, which ends up making a really nice mold when it's done. So I'm pretty excited about this one here. This will end up being a mold for essentially the cockpit of about a 4-foot long hydroplane, RC hydroplane mold that we're building. So the casting media itself, if you look at it right here, this is a pretty nice finish that you have here. So it's a little bit better than your typical plaster of Paris. This is not, it might have a little bit of release age on it, but it's essentially just smooth. The shine is actually what it looks like after you polish it to about a 400 grit. So this is really, really nice stuff. It comes in a bag. I'm sure I'll link it somewhere up here. I think it's about $50–$60 a bag, a large bag of this stuff. And it goes a fair, I don't know, I was going to say it goes a long way, but it kind of depends upon what you're doing with it. This right here, to make things go a little bit better, what you're going to see is you can kind of see I got some fiberglass here. So I've made a cast essentially. So if you look at this, like the frame, the plug, if you will, the fiberglass piece is inside of here. I did your typical stuff, which again, this is not supposed to be a mold making exercise. I just want to show you about this different type of media that I have here. Anyways, I did the build up with a clay, and I used this plastic here as a little bit of a support for the flange where the two parts meet. And I've used some hot glue, which is a little bit different than what some people use. Hot glue to hold things in places, clay to hold things in places, whatever we got to hold things in places, just so you can get this quick, fast mold done. And it is actually done now on both sides here. If I can turn this around carefully. So here's one side, here's the other side. If you can see right through the middle there is the flange. So what I want to do is set this down and take it apart and take a look at how well it came out. So I waxed the mold up with this initially. This is the Isocoat 531. The main purpose here with this one is it is a wax, like a regular paste wax, that basically has every toxic chemical in the world here to melt this down into an aerosol form that you can spray. So what happens is when you spray this out, it'll look like it's liquid, but after about maybe a minute or so it'll dry and it will have a haze and a feel of a paste wax, but it goes on in thin form. Not a whole lot of wax in one of these things, right? So I think they're about $15 a can, the same as all release agents. You're going to go through it. This stuff here I use on top of the other here. This is a little bit more like an oil, so it goes on kind of oily and it stays oily. Well, the thing that we've seen is if you end up sanding something, say to like a 400 grit, and we have small little micro scratches, if you will, in it, this sort of floats and fills in all that stuff and maybe helps it come out a little bit smoother. I don't have any big time empirical evidence on anything this yet, but what I've been doing is spraying this down first to get a good stick contact, but buff it around if you feel that it's necessary, right? Maybe 1 or 2 coats, right? Maybe just one of these, and then light spritz of this as well. If I'm doing a metal mold and I'm making multiple parts successively, I usually just take something like this. Maybe I wax it really good to begin with, this, or even a paste wax, polish it out. Then I hit it with this, spritz, spritz, make a mold. Done, take it out, spritz, spritz, wipe this around, and then just, one coat of this every time. All right, so now I'm going to tear this apart. I have my spatulas right here. I have some wedges around here as well. But I think probably what's going to happen is this is going to be pretty non-eventful, which is also why I explained all about that stuff there, because it works so well that this usually just falls apart. Even when I was just rolling it over earlier to show you about it, I was worried that it would just come apart. So usually no problem separating stuff. So we'll see. So if I look up here, here is the plastic, the mylar I have inside here that I was using for the flange. So I can just take this out. There you go. Now you can see the piece inside of here. So this is a fiberglass part that I got from RC Boat Company, if you can see it inside of there. So they were great. We have this mold, and what we're doing is we're using it in class as a reason, or as a vehicle, if you will, no pun intended, to talk about different ways to make molds. So in this case here, we have this cockpit kind of section that they have here. This is the part that sits on top of a hydroplane. We need to figure out how to take a mold of it. It has a small amount of a negative draft, so we were not able to just make a single mold of it. We had to create a two-part mold and define the part line. So that's a typical thing going on here. So if you look, I'll try to show you inside here the negative draft. This right here was the reason why we couldn't do it. And then if you look right here, here should be our part line. So let's see how well this works. Oh, incidentally, the reason, if you see this discoloration in there, that was a little test. I was pigmenting the plaster, if you will, the Drystone Casting Media. I was pigmenting it to try to make the plug or the mold, whichever way you want to look at this, because it might be different. Talk about that in a minute. I thought I might do that. It's a great idea, but it was a little bit more of a hassle. So at any rate. So I feel like what I'm going to have to do to get this to separate well is I think it probably separates nice along the seam line, but it's wrapped over itself on the back side. So I'll be right back. I'm going to run over to the bandsaw and I'm going to trim this off. I might come back with two pieces because I suspect it might even fall apart while I'm cutting it. So, well, that was basically a pain in the ass. It's a giant mess. Be safe doing that. It's not good to breathe all this stuff. It's essentially plaster Paris in its core, but it's got a bunch of a couple other things in it. Read the bag, so you'll see. You're not supposed to be eating this stuff. Matter of fact, it also mentions, even though this does look a hell of a lot like a cast, it does say, do not, it very specifically says on the bag, put this on your body parts, right? Whatever you might do with it, right? Because it will get hot. It does have an exothermic reaction, so when this thing does start to set, it will start to get warm, and then it will harden up, and basically you might have to call the paramedics and explain what you're doing with a bunch of plaster on yourself. So be careful with that. The mold works fine. It goes together just like it's supposed to. You don't really care about there's some small cracks here and there. This is fine for this. If I want this to get, I can finish this a little bit more. So if you can tell on camera, it's smooth, but it's a little bit dull. I could easily shine it up like this one right here. I could get that all nice and polished, but at the same time, I might not want to lose the subtle detail that you see right in here. So I'd have to be careful of that if I care, right? I know that I could just polish this up, wax this up with release agent, and it'll pull it out. Now, just a couple of last things here. The thing I mentioned in the beginning, that this is my mold, right? So this is my mold, and this is the part that I made this from. So you would say this is the mold, and you might say that this is the plug, but that's not exactly necessarily true in this case, because while this is a mold of that, we might try laying up inside of here. I might hold this together and pour more plaster inside of this to pull a plug out of this that I could then be a single unit that's something like this, and then maybe I could just vacuum bag that. See, I can't vacuum bag this because it's going to crush it, right? And I don't want to ruin this one, right? Otherwise, I could just take this, fill it full of plaster, or maybe even 2-part foam, but that'll probably still squish, to get something that I could use to wrap around. When it comes to vacuum bagging, it is a lot better. It's kind of weird because you look at this and you say this is not a mold. People say this is a mold because it's a cavity, but that's really irrelevant. You would look at this and say, well, if I need to take a vacuum bag and suck down into this, there's a whole lot of places where you're going to get bridging, and it's going to become very difficult, if not close to impossible, to create a mold that will fit in tightly into all these nice, gaps and spaces and everything here. So what you do is you flip the thing over, you wrap all your material over it, and then you suck down around. The only ups and downs here is that this becomes the mold surface, so when you pull this apart, the inside is now shiny instead of the outside. And if you care about that, if this is supposed to be a net part, you're supposed to just pull this out of the mold, maybe paint it and be done with it, then you might not want to have that. Then that's where this comes in. So if I take this and I polish this really, really nice, and I get it to pull a nice surface out of this, then this can come out. I mean, we could do a little bit of sanding, right? Or if it is basically the bumps are small enough that you could just primer coat it and then sand the primer. If that's good, if that's enough, then that's enough, and then you just paint it afterwards, right? If you're trying to do a part out of carbon fiber and you want the look, right, or it's just going to be a gel coat pop out done, then this one here probably needs to be polished, and this seam line is going to have to be cleaned up a bit more. Anyway, that's it. The main thing I want to talk about is this material right here. It's called Drystone Casting Media. It's a little bit nicer than your typical plaster of Paris. It does make a nice smooth finish. You'll notice that I added some fiberglass into this here to help as a reinforcer. That's not exactly necessary. Relatively cheap for a big bag of this stuff. Hopefully that's helpful. Give you some ideas on things that you can do. So if I do feel like I want to clean this up a little bit, I usually don't start with anything more than lower than 400 grit. You can use some water in here, but I usually use alcohol because it evaporates a little bit quicker. Now, as I'm sanding this, I want to watch out for these little ridges, but I don't care about the rest of it. Matter of fact, I might not even ultimately care about those ridges, but they're there, so I want to keep them. The other part that I was mentioning is this might become a plug. So I might end up filling this whole thing in with plaster, just so I can get a solid piece that looks just like the piece that I molded this from, but it'll be solid, so it won't squish under force, like under the vacuum bag. Then, whereas like these pieces here, these depressed pieces, or these raised pieces here, or whatever the way it might be going, you might be able to sand the high spots out now like this, and the low spots, you can't sand away low spots because they're a low spot, so you let that be, and then when you make for the mold of that, when you pull it out, the low spots are now high spots, and then you can go ahead and sand those away, and then take a mold of that mold. The thing to be concerned about that is shrinkage of the part, right, or the media that you're using. Now, plaster is kind of known for not having too much of a shrinkage to it, so that's pretty nice. Whereas things like polyester resin and other types of medias will have some shrink to them. And then there's a story I remember that Adam Savage from Mythbusters was telling, he did a TED talk on. It was really good. If you look it up, it's pretty decent. It was a talk about failure, and there's this long conversation or story that he was telling about how he wanted to make a perfect replica of the original Maltese Falcon, and to make the long story short, he eventually ended up getting to borrow kind of a replica or something of that, or maybe one of the originals. Anyways, made a mold of that, made a mold of it. He wanted it in a different kind of media, so he essentially made a mold of used one type of media to take the mold, and then maybe another mold, if I remember right, to go to another, to ultimately be able to pour it out of whatever metal it was. Well, what ended up happening, as the story goes, didn't take into consideration the shrinkage of every time he did the mold. So by the time it was done, he had a perfect looking part. But it had an offset of maybe 100 thou or something like that, so it wasn't quite perfect. So ultimately, his stories of failure are like other people's story of success, but it was just a thing to remember, that whenever you're taking these things, you can only go so many times with it before you start to lose fidelity, I guess. Alright, so let that dry away. I don't know if you can see any difference there. Nice tone. So it polishes up good. I don't have any in between, so I'm jumping straight up to 1500. Now, I'm not really worrying about this too much. This is just to show you kind of what you would do. I'm not getting here and all over the place. Yeah, so this is IPA, by the way, isopropyl alcohol. Not super good for the hands. So as I'm sanding this here, when you sand, each successive grit should take, don't quote me on this exactly, but about half as long as the other. You'll feel the sandpaper start out kind of rough as it's gripping. The grit is gripping. And then as you work it, it starts to get smoother. You kind of know that you're done with that grit. Probably is a good idea to have some ventilation here when you're doing this. Okay, I like it. There. So it's starting to look better. So being a plaster and maybe somewhat porous, that's another reason why I'm going with the alcohol. To be honest, alcohol around here is always accessible and reachable, whereas water is over somewhere else. And I haven't even tried it yet with water, but I kind of made an assumption that it would soak in a little bit, and I'd have to sit here a little bit longer before I could polish it or use it, because I'd have to wait for all the water to dry out. Now, when that's all done, I'll take a little bit of a release agent or a wax. So this is that spray-on general purpose release agent. This is when I was saying that it goes on kind of oily. So polish it a little bit more here and there, but hopefully you can see the shine there. And then, where's the other one? Kind of a compare. So there's a quick look at plaster as a casting media. It's an oldie but a goodie. When you have your polyurethanes, your silicones, and all your different types of resins out there, all these different ways to make a mold, a quick fast mold, this one's pretty good. It doesn't require any kind of heat curing. You don't have to put it in an oven. It sets up in hours. You can do one half. I think I did the other half of this, you know, about an hour or two later after the first side. So you get something done pretty quickly. And if you don't care about little things like a couple bubbles here and there, if that's not going to be the end of the world, then this is maybe the thing to do. So for this one here, one thing that could have been a little bit better is if I would have made my flanges a little bit longer here. It's going to be a little bit difficult to put some pins in here to hold this together. But again, it's cheap. I can always make another one. And then ultimately, if this isn't good enough, you know, if it's something like this, you know, if it's still too rough for you, then you always have the option to go back to 3D design, right? And then you can make yourself something like this. So this is the horizontal stabilizer. This was done up in 3D design and then milled out on the mill, obviously. This is probably in an upcoming video for this one. This will ultimately be a compression mold. So that's it. Thanks for watching.